Welcome to Public Rights of Way, presented by Peter Berg, Project Coordinator of Technical Assistance at Great Lakes ADA Center. Peter has been coordinating and providing technical assistance as well as conducting training on various aspects of the ADA since he joined the Great Lakes Centers in October of 2000. He is a graduate of North Central College in Naperville, Illinois, with a bachelor's degree in history. In June of 2017, he completed the ADA Coordinator Training Certification Program, ACTCP, through the University of Missouri College of Human Environmental Sciences School of Architectural Studies. The session will begin shortly. Please ask your questions in the Q&A panel. If you require or want to use the built-in caption feature, please turn it on by going to the closed captions button in the video controls. After the completion of the conference, each recording will be captioned using ADA standards to ensure that captions are appropriate and ADA compliant.
Welcome, everyone. What I plan to do today in the time that we have available is to provide an overview of the public rights of way guidelines. The presentation that I'm using is one that the Access Board has used. The Access Board is the federal agency that is charged with creating accessibility guidelines under both the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, as well as under the Architectural Barriers Act, ABA. Because we have a short amount of time, I do want to hopefully leave time for questions at the end. In the case that we don't get to your question or you have additional questions, all of my contact information is at the end of the presentation, including the center's toll-free 800 number, my direct phone number here at the center, and my email address. There's also contact information for the U.S. Access Board. And they are a great resource for information, their website, and then contact information as well for the U.S. Department of Justice. All right, so slide number 2, please. What we're going to look at here is the proposed public rights of way guidelines. So R1, which is the application, and this is similar in structure to the current enforceable standards, which I'll talk about in a moment. R2, which is the scoping requirement. Scoping means what elements, how many elements are required to be accessible. R3, the technical requirements. So scoping, what elements, how many are required to be accessible, and then R3 technical requirements tells us how those elements, those spaces are required to be accessible, and then R4 are supplementary accessibility requirements. The basis for the public rights of way guidelines were are the ADA standards, and they were adapted for the public right of way because the public right of way is a unique environment. And as we go on to the next slide, slide 3, the current enforceable standards under the ADA are the 2010 ADA standards, what we previously folks would have called ADAG, what those were, that the original 1991 ADA standards for accessible design. Since March 15th of 2012, the 2010 standards have been the enforceable standards, but those standards apply specifically to sites and buildings and elements and spaces on a site. And so in the public right-of-way realm, we're talking about a different environment, different elements, and different requirements. Public rights of way guidelines draft was originally published back in the last version was published back in 2011, and there was a supplement to that in 2013 to include shared use paths under the rulemaking for public rights of way. During the previous administration, there was a suspension on a lot of rulemaking and regulatory work because of executive orders that required federal agencies, in essence, to in order to issue new regulations, new requirements, a federal agency was required to eliminate 2 existing rules, and the Access Board, in terms of the ADA and the guidelines that it publishes, didn't have that flexibility to eliminate two existing rules that they had. So the hope is, and we've heard from the Access Board and presentations that they've done and some of their public comments, is that hopefully sometime next year we will see rulemaking that will finalize the public rights of way. Now, when the Access Board is done, that unfortunately in the federal arena is not the end of the rulemaking process. The Access Board, as I mentioned, is the agency designed with creating the accessibility guidelines. But then in order to become enforceable under the ADA, the Departments of Justice and Department of Transportation, which are going to have enforcement responsibility here, primarily the Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration for the public right-of-way, then need to go through their own regulatory process and rulemaking process to make those enforceable standards. However, I think that once the Access Board publishes this as a final guideline, the ADA requires that, that whatever the Access Board publishes, that those are the minimum requirements under the ADA. Now, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Justice can increase the accessibility requirements or increase scoping. Just as an example, when the Access Board updated the ADA guidelines, it required 2% of detention and prison cells to be accessible. When the Department of Justice went through its rulemaking process and adopted the Access Board's guidelines, it increased that scoping to 3%. So at least, hopefully a year from now or whenever the Access Board actually publishes this as a final guideline, you will know that these are the minimum requirements, that it's not going to go below that, and you may have an increase in some areas, not too likely, but at least we know that these are the minimum requirements. All right, on to slide number 4. So what we're talking about here is circulation paths that are in the public right of way. The draft guidelines, just like the standards that apply to the built environment, allow for equivalent facilitation, and that is the concept that you're allowed to depart from the specific technical requirements within the guidelines where you are providing equal or greater access. Unfortunately, there's not a review process to determine, equivalent facilitation. That's on the agency, the entity, the department that is claiming equivalent facilitation to be able to demonstrate that if they're ever challenged on that. And then finally, the PROAG, just like the 2010 standards, references industry standards. And in this instance, PROAG references the MUTCD industry standards. All right, slide number 5. Applies to both ADA, so facilities covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're talking about state and local governments, as well as ABA, Architectural Barriers Act, which applies to the federal government, so federal properties. And what we're talking about here is new construction and alterations. In addition to new construction alteration, temporary facilities are also subject to PROAG, just as in the 2010 standards. Temporary facilities are covered, and this may come into play in your jurisdiction, where we have seen during the pandemic, local governments allowing restaurants to set up dining areas in the public right of way out in the streets. So the restaurant has obligations under Title III of the ADA, and the municipality that's allowing the use is going to have some obligations under PROAG for these temporary facilities. Slide 6, alterations. And that's primarily what we're talking about in the public right of way. While there is some new construction and development, primarily what we're talking about in applying PROAG to is to existing conditions and alterations. And the requirement is that it be accessible to the extent practicable or feasible, because we know that there are lots of current existing conditions where it's not going to be possible to apply new construction technical requirements because there are existing site constraints that are going to preclude or prevent full compliance with new constructions. This recommendation of documenting, comes from the Access Board, and it's just a generally good idea that if you're unable to fully comply, that you have documentation. Again, so if ever challenged, you can go back and show this was our thought process. We wanted to fully comply. We planned to fully comply, but these are the reasons, A, B, C, why we couldn't, because of existing site constraints, existing slope in the public right of way that prevented us from full compliance. The buildings were, right on top of the public right of way. It wasn't possible to provide a 48-inch access route in the public right of way. The sidewalk was just too narrow in those places. And then transition segments to the greatest extent feasible. And what that means is that, for example, if you're doing a project and replacing, curb ramps as a street is being resurfaced, so the curb ramps are being replaced at each of the intersections, and that's the extent of the project. And then you have sidewalks that adjoin public access route that adjoins those curb ramps. The recommendation requirement is to put in some sort of transition so that you don't go right from a compliant curb ramp to a landing and then all of a sudden you're on a sidewalk that has a significant running and cross slope, that you provide an additional, for example, segment or square of sidewalk in that transition so that the change in slope is not as abrupt for the user. All right, slide 7. Like many portions of the 2010 standards, the PROAG doesn't necessarily require things. So, just like the 2010 standards, the ADA, it's not a building code. It doesn't require things for the most part. When things are provided, that's when, it's required to be, accessible. So if there's no existing pedestrian or pedestrian route, there's no requirement to install sidewalks, even though there may be signs, there's a grassy area and you see that there's been pedestrian foot traffic going through that, that grassy area. It doesn't trigger or require that the public entity put in, an accessible circulation path in that area. It's where provided, the public right of way needs to be accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. Slide 8, pedestrian access route. The PROAG guidelines require that the access route be a minimum of 48 inches in width. Again, this could be a situation where in existing conditions you may not be able to achieve that, but that is the minimum requirement for that access path. And that needs to, on the next slide, needs to be maintained around obstructions. The Great Lakes Center, we're located here in Chicago, on just a little south and west of the downtown loop area. And if you've ever visited Chicago, a lot of the downtown area has very ample and wide sidewalks, and there's street furniture, and there are trees and planters and all sorts of stuff, and they're able to more than maintain that 48 inches of width around obstructions. I can tell you here, where we're located on the west side of the UIC campus, down Taylor Street, which is an old Italian neighborhood, there are trees that are planted in the sidewalks, and at these locations, there are spots where you have maybe 24 inches of width between. I'm thinking of one particular spot where between the tree and the little cutout in the dirt area and a sidewalk. Very difficult for someone in a mobility device to get down there. Could be very problematic for someone that's blind or low vision. So the requirement is to maintain that minimum 48 inches. Slide 10. Just like the 2010 standards, every where the sidewalk is at that minimum 48 inches in width, every 200 feet, you're required to have a 60 by 60 inch passing space. And this is for individuals in mobility that use mobility devices, whether that's a wheelchair, scooter, or someone walker cane using a walker, so that they have space to be able to pass each other. Uh, Shared use paths, which are outside of the public right of way. PROAG does not mandate or does not specify a minimum width, but whatever the width of that shared use path, the entire width must be accessible. So no minimum width of a shared use path, but whatever is provided, the entire width of the shared use path must be accessible. And then next slide, slide 13, just again listing the minimum requirements for minimum widths. Onto I'm sorry, now I'm at slide 13. Running slope. Okay, so when you have the public right of way, or in the circulation path is within the public right of way, the running slope shall not exceed the running slope of the adjacent roadway. So if you have an adjacent roadway, that has a 9% running slope, your running slope of your sidewalk can be as great as the running slope of that adjacent roadway. On to slide number 14. Shared use pass, the 5% maximum when the shared use path is not contained within the public right of way. You could have situations where you do have a shared use path, and for example, that may intertwine at points and at times be outside the public right of way, and at times be within the public right of way. But for the areas of a shared use path that are located outside of the public right of way, maximum running slope is 5%. We have pedestrian access routes. So we have street crossings, 5% maximum for the accessible when it's in a pedestrian street crossing for the running slope. Pedestrian street crossings on to slide number 16. The PROAG does not specify, does not require that the pedestrian street crossings be marked or striped, or doesn't specify how they must be striped. So that can be left up to local or state requirements, not a requirement within the PROAG. And MUCDD standards, again, not required by PROAG to have that striping. Cross slope for circulation path, 0% cross slope is going to be best for persons that use mobility devices. The issue with cross slope is when you have a significant cross slope, especially for someone in a manual wheelchair, as they're going down a circulation path, where that cross slope is so significant, they're having to push harder on one side of their wheelchair than the other, just to keep going in a straight line, and that can be very difficult for a lot of users. Obviously, you need to have some type of cross slope for drainage. Same thing as when you talk about accessible parking spaces in the access aisle. There needs to be drainage. You don't want water building up there. You don't want it freezing in those areas. So the maximum allowable cross slope is 2%. There are certain exceptions for street crossings, but within your circulation accessible path, your public sidewalks, your cross slope maximum is 2%. Onto slide 18. Where you have some type of traffic that is controlling traffic flow, so where you have yield, you have traffic signals, you have a stop sign. With the stop control, your cross slope is going to be a maximum of 2%. And again, that's at where you have some type of control at that crossing. So yield sign, stop sign, traffic signal. At to slide 19. Without yield or stop controls, the cross slope can be a maximum of 5%. So this could be a mid block. This could be an intersection where it's uncontrolled, and traffic is yielding to, hopefully they're yielding to the vehicle on the right. But where you have no controls at that intersection, your cross slope for the pedestrian crossing could be a maximum of 5%. And here, I'm sorry, I misspoke there. The mid block street crossings can be the grade of the street or highway where it is a mid block street crossing. Cross slope at driveways. There are ways to address this. This can be a significant issue for wheelchair users, especially in residential areas where you may have sidewalks, every 10, 15, 20, 20 feet. You want to, come up with the design so that you have that front portion, the apron portion of the driveway coming up, and then leveling off at the sidewalk, and then continuing to slope up towards the home and the garage. So there are ways to manage that and design that, both in residential areas and in areas where you have commercial driveways, so driveways into the business. But it really needs to be part of that planning process as you're looking at designing that, or where you have a developer putting in a residential subdivision, and requiring them to make sure where they're putting in sidewalks that you don't have these cross slopes that can not only be difficult for someone in a wheelchair, but also pose a significant danger and cause someone to be forced in rolling down the sidewalk towards or down the driveway towards the street. Slide 22. Not going to spend a lot of time here, but showing here openings in the accessible circulation path. So you get these gratings and other types of openings, or where you have, again, trees or other type of foliage in the public right of way, and you've got gratings there to allow water to get to those areas. Limitations on the size of those, again, becomes a hazard for both individuals that are using mobility devices, as well as canes, crutches, or someone that's blind that's using a white cane can get that cane tip stuck in that area. But for persons that they're using mobility devices, it could be a situation where they get dumped out of their mobility device. Changes in level similar to the built environment. You can have a change in level up to 1/4 inch that is untreated. Anything that is greater than 1/4 inch needs to be beveled. Excuse me. Here's photos of a flangeway gap. So we're talking about at rail crossings, and the allowance for the gap at a flangeway is going to be dependent on the type of rail crossing, the type of tracks. That flangeway gap can be larger where you have freight trains and commuter rail trains that are going on tracks versus where you have light rail tracks. The flangeway gap is maximum distance is smaller than at your freight rail, and that's just based on the size of the cars that are using those, and the size of the rails themselves for the cars. Side 25, alternate pedestrian access routes. In this PROAG references the MUTCD Chapter 6, or I'm sorry, Section 6 for this particular section, and you want to maintain the usability of the public right of way and keep it on the same side of the street. I'll give you a quick example of something that happened to me on Monday. I am someone who is blind and use a guide dog to travel. And leaving work on Monday night, decided to take a different route with the guide dog to get to our preferred bus stop, and we got to an intersection that was torn up, and the sidewalk just sort of ended, and there was stone, and to continue to cross the street in front of us, or to go left down the street that instead of crossing and turning left, it was just stone. And they had some yellow, type construction tape up that I finally encountered when I realized the dog had stopped short, indicating to me that there was some type of barrier. But I was a full block past where I had crossed, and required me to turn around and go back an entire block in order to get around this construction project. I had no idea going into there that there was anything going on. I took my white cane out and began probing around and realized that there was no sidewalk, and was able to take a couple steps forward, and the entire street was, from where I was able to explore, was stone. But again, so I had to backtrack an entire block in order to get around this particular barrier, and that could have been an even greater barrier for someone who uses a wheelchair, who may not have realized until they got closer that this particular crossing was not passable because of the destruction of what's going on. So using some type of audible pedestrian signal would have been great, a block earlier, that there was some type of audible notification letting me know that the sidewalk up ahead was closed, and that I needed to either cross the street, to the south, to get around this, or that I needed to head north to the next block to Taylor Street, and then continue west to get around this particular obstruction. And this certainly, what I just described, you did not have cane detectable, barricades. I was, if I was using a cane, I would have been well under these, the construction tape that was hung there to keep people out of that space. I was fortunate that I had the dog who pulled up short and stopped, because the dog knew that this was not a place that we were going to get through. Temporary traffic controls, again, references the industry standards. For those, I'm not going to spend time on that. We're going to go on to slide number 7 and move into curb ramps. Running slope is the maximum 8.3%, or the 1 to 12 slope for your curb ramps. 2% cross slope. And there are some exceptions for that. Minimum width is 48 inches for your curb ramps, and where you have a curb ramp that is part of a shared use path, the curb ramp must be the same width as the shared use path. So if the shared use path is 6 feet, approaching that that street crossing, or where that curb ramp is located, that curb ramp must be 6 feet in width. Required to have a landing at the top of perpendicular cross ramps, because it is difficult for someone who's using a mobility device, in particular someone that's using a manual wheelchair, to be going up a slope and be expected to try to make a change in direction. It's very difficult. It can be dangerous. It can cause someone to be thrown from their wheelchair. And requirement to have flush transitions. So at the bottom of your curb ramps, that it's flush. You're at the bottom as someone's entering into the street. Again, becomes problematic for wheelchair users. The front wheels potentially getting stuck, or them getting stopped and getting thrown from their wheelchairs. And then and also providing perpendicular grade lakes. This picture that you're seeing right now is what just referred to as a cookie cutter. It comes directly from the ProAg technical requirements. You're probably not going to have too many curb ramps that look like this. Again, because you're primarily dealing with existing environments, and you're probably not going to be able, because of existing site constraints, not going to be able to design a curb ramp that looks exactly like that. All right, next slide, 29. Perpendicular curb ramps are perpendicular to the curb or street. Um, Slide 30, here's an example photo of a parallel curb ramp. And that is where your curb ramp is parallel to the street. Slide 31, illustration of a blended transition. You know, the optimal design for curb ramps is having you know, two curb ramps at each corner, so one in each direction that someone would be crossing the street. Diagonal curb ramps, you know, while they are allowed in the 2010 you know, standards, not recommended in the public right of way. And they're only allowed in ProAg as a last option. So they're you know, really discouraged from using this type of curb ramp design, and should only be considered where there are no other options. So, you know, where you can't provide, you know, for example, a depressed you know, curb ramp at an intersection, and then you know, slope up the sidewalk from there. And as I said, they are, you know, permitted on a site in the 2010 standards in Chapter 4. And then next slide is this is an example showing that you know, two curb ramps per corner. Again, you know, best designed for ease of mobility device users, as well as individuals who are blind or low vision, in terms of assisting in navigation and getting someone lined up to cross the street within the pedestrian crosswalk. Here, not going to spend a lot of time on this. Just some examples of where folks got creative. Again, dealing with existing environments and using some methods to provide access in existing conditions. So sloping the sidewalk down and shortening the distance of the, you know, perpendicular curb ramp. 35 running slope, a question that we get, you know, somewhat frequently. I know that the Access Board gets this question, you know, frequently, is, you know, what's the, you know, the running slope of a curb ramp, and you know, the guidance is that basically you don't want to be chasing, you know, slope. I mean, theoretically, you could have a curb ramp that is, you know, 30, 40 feet long, where you're trying to achieve that maximum running slope of 8.3%. But, you know, in ProAg, the rule is that, you know, 15 feet, you don't want to make it any longer than 15 feet, your curb ramp, and get your running slope to whatever you can achieve within that 15 feet, and then get someone to a level landing and onto that accessible pedestrian path. The reason being is that because in a curb ramp, you're not required to have landings like you do on your traditional type of ramp. So having a running slope that's over 5%, you know, can be a greater barrier than having a running slope that exceeds 8.3% for a short period of time. So if you're just extending out your curb ramp, trying to chase that slope and get it at 8.3%, which is while that's the maximum allowable, if you've walked up a ramp that is at that 1 to 12 or 8.3%, that's pretty steep. Even though it's allowable, it is very steep. The commuter rail station that I use on a daily basis has a ramp that leads down to be able to go underneath the tracks, and it's at that 1 to 12. It's at an 8.3%, and it is walking up it. You notice it. It is a significant slope, and that does have landings in it. So the point here is that you don't want to be chasing your running slope down the sidewalk. Get what you can in at 15 feet, at whatever slope you can achieve, and then get someone to that landing. Your cross slope at curb ramps onto the next slide, 36. So where you again have controlled intersections, stop signs, yield, traffic signals, your curb ramp maximum cross slope is the 2%, and then it's 5% where there's a crossing without traffic control. So 2% where you have traffic control, 5% max cross slope where there's no control. Uh, 37 minimum width of your curb ramp is 48 inches for your parallel curb ramps. And as I said, the curb ramp must extend the full width where it's contained within a shared use path. Slide 38, landings. I mentioned this. When you don't have landings at the top of a curb ramp, it makes it significantly difficult if someone in a wheelchair is making a change in direction. Attempting to change directions while still on dealing with a running slope is going to be significantly difficult, if not impossible, for some users within the public right of way. Right, slide number 39 shows a image of a landing. I'm sorry, turning space at a parallel curb ramp, and then shows a level landing at both the top and bottom of a parallel curb ramp. Here showing a grade break that allows for that transition. You again want to have these grade breaks, especially if you're coming out of the street. You don't want to have the flush area at the bottom of the curb ramp, and then all of a sudden you've got this significant incline going up the curb ramp. You want to have that transition, the grade break, be at 2%, 3%, that allows that transition, because an individual, some wheelchairs contain a wheel in the back to prevent people from tipping over, and individuals can get stuck where there is that significant change. You're coming up from the street, and now you have the running slope of the curb ramp. Someone can get stuck, not just in a manual wheelchair, but someone in a scooter or in a power wheelchair, and is going to have to wait there until they can get someone to assist them. So having that grade break, and that grade break being perpendicular to the direction of travel.
Peter, I just want to let you know that it is 2 o'clock.
Thank you very much. All right, here we've got a photo of example of 2 perpendicular grade breaks, and showing that both wheels of the wheelchair need to be able to hit the grade break at the same time. Again, don't want someone tipping over where that is uneven. Slide 42, looking at the counter slope. This has to do with algebra, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because that's not my forte here. And basically, it's talking about a 13% maximum. So if you've got your running slope of your pedestrian crossing is at 5%, and your curb ramp is at roughly 8.3%. That's your maximum. You don't want to or cannot exceed that maximum of 13%. Here showing again that you have a flush, the transition is flush between grade breaks, again, to avoid someone being dumped out of their wheelchair or getting stuck. Those changes at those grade breaks need to be flush and level and smooth. All right, detectable warnings. So one of my favorite areas. Currently, the ADA standards require detectable warnings. The enforceable 2010 standards require detectable warnings on platforms, transit platforms only. That's the only place in the 2010 standards where detectable warnings are required. They're not required on sites. But in ProAg, detectable warnings are required, wherever you have that curb ramp that is entering into a street. So all street crossings, you're required to have detectable warnings. Driveways, I can tell you that where detectable warnings are overused, they begin to lose their meaning, and so you obviously don't want to have detectable warnings in a residential area. At every driveway, again, becomes meaningless, and you could wind up having detectable warnings every 15, 20, 30 feet. In a downtown, area, again, what is the driveway that the individual is crossing, and what is the meaning, and what is the necessity to warn someone that they're crossing a space where traffic is going to be flowing. In a downtown area, crossing alleys, detectable warning should be provided there. You could have vehicles, you could have trucks coming out of that alley. Out of commercial, parking garages, it may make sense, especially I think of places here in Chicago where you have commercial garages where vehicles a lot of times can't see the sidewalk. They really don't have a view until they've pulled clear of the opening to that parking structure. So you'd want to warn someone that's blind or low vision that there may be a vehicle that's exiting out of this parking structure. Again, detectable warnings. The reason why detectable warnings are required is to give someone that's blind or low vision a cue that they're entering into a hazardous vehicular area. Prior to the ADA and prior to curb ramps, individuals that traveled with a cane or with a dog, a curb was a natural cue. Okay, if I step off this curb, I'm entering into some type of vehicular way, into a street, into a parking lot, into an alley. Well, in order to make the public right-of-way accessible, curb ramps are necessary for people that use mobility devices. So there needed to be a way to replace that curb, that cue for someone that's blind or low vision, and that was with truncated domes or these detectable warnings. So it gives that cue to someone that's blind or low vision that they're entering into that hazardous vehicular way. The depth of the detectable warning path is or area is at 24 inches minimum, and required to be in the direction of travel. That 24-inch minimum width is also what's required on transit platforms. The ProAg requires that there be color contrast, doesn't specify what that contrast must look like, but there must be contrast between the detectable warning area and the adjacent sidewalk. As I mentioned, required at boarding platforms, whether it's on a site, so at a commuter rail station or at the Chicago Union Station or any other type of, train station on a site by the 2010 standards, and now also by ProAg, you've seen excuse me, cities that, have gone to more light rail installation. Minneapolis putting in light rail. Well, this light rail is being put in within the public right of way. So the PROAG is going to require that you have detectable warnings at those transit platforms where people are boarding, getting on and off of those light rail. The next slide, please. Thank you. The 2010 standards borrowed actually from PROAG when the 2010 standards were updated in the design of detectable warnings. So there's much more detail now in terms of the size of the truncated dome, and there's greater spacing between the truncated domes, because the original requirements for truncated domes in the 91 standards required that the truncated domes be located on the entire width and depth of the curb ramp, and that was a significant area, and there wasn't much spacing, which caused difficulty for individuals using wheelchairs and other mobility devices as they were bouncing, over the truncated dome. So there's the technical requirements now have greater spacing to allow easier transition through that area by individuals that use mobility devices. Other types of designs have been tested and researched. There were times where there were grooved patterns put in sidewalks, but those are significantly less detectable than raised truncated domes, and over time, you have those groove areas become filled in with other types of things. Now there have been advancements in the types of materials that are used for truncated domes. I know, being here at the university for nearly 21 years, at the intersection, one of the intersections just a block away from here, I think that the curb ramps and detectable warnings have been replaced at least a half dozen times. And oftentimes it's due to the detectable warnings that were installed have worn down. Over time, they've come up with some new material, where it's been an implant where the truncated dome strip has been put into the cement surface, and those have seemed to last a little bit longer. I've seen examples of using a steel, truncated domes that are inserted into the space. But those, it being in the Midwest, being in Ohio and Illinois, that that can be an issue during the winter, where where you have freezing and thawing, and you have snow blowers and plows and shovels that can cause a degradation and deterioration and basically chunking off the detectable truncated warning. But detectable warning, the truncated dome is really the best design for persons that are blind or low vision. The here image showing that the where are we at? Slide 47. Sorry. So detectable warning located at the grade break, and then a maximum of 5 feet from the back of if the space at the bottom of the curb ramp is less than 5 feet. Detectable warnings at refuge islands. This is a critical area, and again, I'll reference Wacker Drive here in Chicago, where you have significant lanes of traffic. I think there are 3 lanes of traffic each way, east and west, depending on what portion of Wacker Drive. But there's a refuge island on the portion near Union Station because of the amount of lanes that are needed to be crossing. So where you provide detectable warnings on a refuge island, you need to have detectable warnings on both sides of that refuge island, and you need to have a space basically, in between that refuge island. You don't want to have a refuge island and only have one set of detectable warnings, because that may indicate to someone that's blind or low vision, okay, I finished crossing the street, I've gotten to the second detectable warning, I know that if I go forward here, I'm on a sidewalk or I'm safe. You don't want to give that indication. So if it's a refuge island, you want detectable warnings as someone first encounters that, a level space, in between, and then another set of detectable warnings to indicate to the individual, okay, now I'm again entering into a hazardous vehicular way. Here, illustration of detectable warnings at rail crossings. Gonna move on to protruding objects, slide 50. Protruding objects, maximum of 4 inches into, a circulation path, while just as, within the 2010 standards only require a minimum, an accessible route to be a minimum of 36 inches. But the protrusion limits in the 2010 standards and the protrusion limits in PROAG is basically wherever anyone can walk, because you don't know how someone that's blind or low vision is going to be traversing that environment. So any place where someone can walk, the protrusion limit of 4 inches applies. So we're talking about something that that is mounted with its leading edge above 27 inches or below 80 inches, can protrude no more than 80 inches into that accessible circulation path. Next slide, post-mounted. This is a section where the PROAG differs from the 2010 standards. So the 2010 ADA standards allow that at a post-mounted object, something can protrude 12 inches into that circulation path. In PROAG, it continues that limit at 4 inches. So even if something is post-mounted, it can protrude no more than 4 inches, into the circulation path or the accessible pedestrian way. If it does, then you need to have another post or something at the bottom of that is cane detectable, something that someone will detect with their cane before they detect it with an arm, their head, their body. And also something to keep in consideration, that protruding objects, don't have to be just fixed elements. They can be living, breathing things such as trees, bushes that overhang an accessible pedestrian way. So making sure that you're responsible and you're in charge, and this comes down to maintenance. It may not be, on the designers, the engineers, the folks that are installing, putting in the sidewalks and curb ramps, but for a local city or state that has responsibility for that pedestrian way, maintaining that is not just maintaining that the sidewalk is in good condition, the cement isn't broken, the detectable warnings are still present. It's also other factors that you have control over, which is maintaining and trimming back bushes or trees that may not, which may also be protruding limits, but could also be limit the minimum accessible width of from 48 inches, where you have that foliage or other things that are growing into that pedestrian way. Okay, looking at ramps here. Now we're talking about your traditional type of ramps. We're not talking about curb ramps. We're talking about ramps where you may have a ramp that is in the public right of way. So you may have your sidewalk, and then to provide access to a business, a restaurant, a building that's located off the public right of way, there's a ramp that comes off of that public right of way. So for ramps, your maximum running slope is 8.3 or 1 to 12. Cross slope is a maximum of 12%. Has to be a minimum of 36 inches wide. The maximum rise for any ramp run is 30 inches. And requirements for both handrails on both sides and edge protection on both sides of the ramp. Requirement for ramps that there be a level landing at the top and bottom of each ramp run. And again, we're talking about ramps. We're not talking about curb ramps. Handrails are never required on curb ramps. I've gotten this question a few times. I've heard from the access board that they get the question, frequently, are handrails, ever required for a curb ramp? And the answer to that is no. What we're talking about here is your traditional type of ramp. So wherever your handrails are required, so where you have a ramp that has a rise greater than 6 inches, you're required to have handrails. Where you're required to have handrails, you're required to have edge protection. So edge protection, some type of something that extends. So something that extends up the surface of the curb ramp 2 inches high, or some type of railing that prevents a sphere from passing through, and again, to prevent wheels, front wheels, canes, crutches from slipping off the side of the ramp. Handrails, the minimum width of your ramp is measured from opposing faces of your handrails. So that minimum 36 inches is from handrail to handrail. Specific requirements in terms of handrail surfaces. Moving on to the next slide, accessible pedestrian signals. Where you're providing, visual notifications, you need to also provide audible notifications. There have the city of New York was sued, and federal judge in that decision said that New York was in violation of the ADA because they had all these intersections with visual pedestrian signals, and there were no audible pedestrian signals. The city of Chicago is currently being sued for a similar matter in the U.S. Department of Justice. The U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of Illinois is joined that lawsuit. So the basic argument is that if you're providing that information visually to pedestrians, you should be providing that same information, to pedestrians who are blind or who have low vision. So where you're altering traffic signals, you should be installing audible pedestrian signals, and you should also have a transition plan in place, identifying, working with the disability community to identify intersections where proactively you're going out and replacing and installing audible pedestrian signals. The crossing time specified at 3.3 seconds. 3.5, which in the MUTCD, it is recommended. In PROAG, it is required to meet that requirement for crossing time. So giving people ample time, adequate time to be able to cross the street, so they don't get stuck out into the middle. So slide 56 just shows illustration of someone crossing. Next slide, slide 57. Again, showing an illustration of someone showing extension of curb extensions to reduce the crossing time needed, or to reduce the crossing distance. Slide 58. Using a refuge island where the the amount of traffic lanes that someone's crossing is significant, using refuge islands as a place where someone can cross and wait for the next signal. Slide 59. This is a question that we get somewhat frequently. Got this question recently from some folks in Ohio. If pedestrian crossing is prohibited, there should be some type of barrier between the sidewalk and the curb itself. Oftentimes we hear the argument, well, there's no curb ramp on the other side, so why do we need to put a curb ramp on this side if crossing it not? And you should put some type of barrier, whether that be fencing or that be a parkway, some type of landscape that is between the edge of the sidewalk and the curb itself. Because if you technically look at the ADA regulations, the Title II regulations covering state and local governments, it specifically states that wherever a sidewalk intersects a curb, there needs to be a curb ramp. So you want to, if it's prohibited, you want to make it clear that it's prohibited. You don't want someone stepping off stepping off of that curb. So putting some type of barrier.
Peter?
Yes.
We are at 221.
221. Thank you. Push button locations. Using mounting locations, maximum 48 inches, 58 inches minimum for your push button signals. 61 operable parts meeting the same requirements that are in the enforceable standards. So no more than 5 pounds of pressure to activate, no tight pinching, twisting, or gripping. Basically, if you can operate it with a closed fist, that's going to meet your requirement for pedestrian signals. This next slide, 62, is just showing your location distance from crosswalk markings to the location of the to the push button location. Orientation, slide number 63. So making clear, which button is for which direction of travel. So where you have a single button at an intersection, making clear that the orientation, if I push this button, I know that I'm going to get the pedestrian cross signal for this direction of crossing, and if I press this button, I'm going to get indication for the other. The face of the push button must also be parallel to the crosswalk as well. 64. And here, showing an example of where there are barriers to the location, between the location of the the pedestrian button, and then being able to push the button and then getting back in place to be able to cross the street in time before you lose the signal. Slide 65 again, showing where push buttons are obstructed by other barriers, bike racks, and so forth. Slide 66. And then here where the MUTCD has its requirements for the push button location. Slide 67, roundabouts that want to highlight here is using where you have multiple lane crossing recommendation to have audible pedestrian signals, and also to provide some type of fencing to direct to crossing locations. Both extremely useful for someone that's blind or low vision, but for any pedestrian, so that they're not going out into the traffic lane. You go quickly here to leave a few minutes here for questions. On-street parking. Number of accessible spaces is based on the total number of marked or metered spaces on a block. And what we talk about in coming up with that scoping, talking about the perimeter of a block. So all 4 sides, if you were to go around a block, a city block, without ever crossing the street, that's what we're talking about, your perimeter. And that's going to give you your total number of metered or marked spaces on that block. And then it's based on that, the total number of accessible spaces that are going to be required. Where your adjacent public right-of-way or sidewalk exceeds 14 feet, the requirement is to put your access aisle within that public right-of-way, allowing someone to exit their vehicle and then be within the public right-of-way. I'm guessing that in most of your existing conditions, your sidewalks, your public right-of-way is not 14 feet in width. And in those instances, the requirement is to place your accessible parking spaces at either end of the block, close to the curb ramp, so that someone can exit a vehicle and get up onto the sidewalk and not be located in the street. I'm sorry, I did not tell you. Slide 71. Where you have angled or perpendicular parking spaces, the requirement is to provide van accessible spaces, meaning that you're required to have an 8-foot wide access aisle. Additionally, the access aisle is required to be on the passenger side. Again, wherever you have angled or perpendicular on street parking. Parking meters or stations. Main takeaway here is that the must meet the requirements for operable parts, so someone must be able to operate it again no more than 5 pounds of pressure, no tight pinching, twisting, grasping in order to operate the parking station. Where you're providing, where passenger loading zones are provided, not just where someone may drop someone off along the sidewalk, but where you have a passenger loading zone in front of a restaurant, a hotel, that's in the public right of way. Needs to be marked. The access aisle, the area adjacent to the passenger loading zone, must be level, and cross slope doesn't exceed 2%, and it must connect to an accessible route onto the sidewalk or into the building that it serves. Where you have bus stops in the public right of way, and we get questions on this because you oftentimes have a difference in jurisdiction. The city, the town, may say, well, we control the public right of way, but the bus stop is, under the control of the transit agency. And the transit agency will say, well, yeah, we control the bus shelter, but we don't control the sidewalks around it. This is where there needs to be collaboration in order to ensure that both the bus stop, which we're looking at on this slide, and in the next slide, the bus shelter, that someone can get from the public right of way, get from the public sidewalk to the bus shelter, and then board the transit vehicle, and then vice versa. When they get to that stop, that they can get off of the bus, go to the bus shelter, or get onto the public sidewalk. And that takes some work sometimes, in having agreements between two governmental agencies to ensure that there is accessibility for people with disabilities. Bus shelters, again, this is a key component, is that there needs to be an accessible route into the bus shelter. There needs to be a clear floor space 30 by 48 inches within the bus shelter, and then there needs to be an accessible route out of the bus shelter to the area where someone is going to board the bus. And then the final item here is we're seeing more and more things pop up in the public right away. Years back it was the rental bikes, and in Chicago we have the divvy bikes, and a few years ago the city began to regulate and license pedestrian or the scooters. I know that Columbus had some issues with scooters where the companies just showed up and dumped these devices into the public right away. And in San Francisco, I'm sure some of you have seen the photographs. While PROAG does not address that, these can be significant barriers for people who have mobility disabilities, or individuals who are blind or low vision. So, local government should take steps to regulate where these types of devices, whether they're bikes or scooters, can be left when they're done, and putting the onus on these companies that are being regulated and licensed to provide these services, to make sure that their customers are following through and not just leaning it up against a fence or laying it in the middle of a sidewalk, and now someone using a wheelchair can't get past there, or someone that's blind or low vision can't get past that particular area. All right. This is the question slide, so if folks want to type in questions, and then I just want to show my contact information here. Both the 800 number, my direct phone number, and my email address are available on the slide now. I know I didn't leave a lot of time and covered a lot of information in a short amount of time, but hopefully the main takeaway here is that you can contact us here at the Great Lakes ADA Center, and that there are other resources out there to assist you, with this, and we can do even more specific, customized, tailored training for you and your particular agency if that's something that you wish to have going forward. So I think we have about 4 or 5 minutes before our hard stop here.
It looks like right now, Peter, we don't have any questions. If anybody has any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A panel so we can get those asked of Peter.
And again, real quick on the rulemaking, it is likely that the Access Board is done with public comments for ProAg, but there will be an opportunity once the Access Board is done with its rulemaking on ProAg. As I mentioned at the beginning, DOT and DOJ has to go through its own set of rulemaking, and part of the regulatory rulemaking process is that they have to go out for public comment. So stay tuned because you still have an opportunity, to provide public comment. And as as I mentioned, what the Access Board publishes are minimum, and DOT, DOJ cannot go beneath that. But you can still submit commentary if you think there are areas that are not clear and you want clarification from the enforcement agencies, as to specifically what is meant, what is intended with the technical requirement, or if a scoping requirement is not clear. You can submit public comment requesting that the federal agency, Transportation and Justice, clarify when they publish their final rule, publish a clarification and explain what is exactly meant by those requirements. So there'll still be an opportunity for you to submit public comments, and people don't think that makes a difference. It can, and it does make a difference, because any public comment that is submitted as part of the rulemaking process, the federal agency actually has to reply to it when it publishes the final rule. So there's actually some really interesting stuff in the Department of Justice regulations for state and local governments and for businesses, where they explain why they made some changes in regulatory language based on public comment, or where they didn't make changes that based on regulatory comments. So there's still an opportunity for you to submit comments on particular areas of ProAg if you find them confusing or don't think that they're clear enough on what the intent is.
Okay, and Peter, we did have a question come in. They're asking, do raised boardwalks follow the same requirements as sidewalks?
Raised, you can have areas that, example of being a university, where you have Main Street go right down the middle of the university, and you would have application of ProAg for those public sidewalks. But then as you get onto the site of the university, those pathways, those sidewalks are going to be subject to the 2010 standards. So if the raised boardwalk is part of the public right of way, then yes, it's going to be subject to the ProAg requirements. If the raised boardwalk is contained within a site and it's outside of the public right of way, then it's going to be subject to the 2010 standards, and have to require with Chapter 4, which is all of the requirements for accessible walking surfaces.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. That's all the questions right now. So just wanted to thank you for all the information. Thank everybody for attending. Please remember, if you have any additional questions or would like to request the slides, you can visit the Disability Inclusion Program's website or email them at odi@das.ohio.gov. And that is everything.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you, sir.